Sure. Well, the issue is that the world that we understand that was formed at the end of World War II, that's what's ending here. It's not like we're all going to die, although not all of us are going to make it to the other side of this. Globalization at its core was a bribe. We provided global security for our allies if in exchange they allowed us to write their security policies when it came to the Cold War. And that exchange lasted until the Cold War ended in 1992. And ever since then, the Americans have been losing interest in electing ever more populist presidents, right up to and including the current one. So our interest in maintaining that network has failed, and since it was a bribe, we never invested our economy in the global network. If we had, it wouldn't have been a bribe. So we are capable of stepping back from that system and our economy more or less being okay, but everyone else is getting whapped up the side of the head. That's kind of half of it. The other half of it is when globalization happened, the world urbanized. And when you move from the farm into the cities, you have fewer kids. You play that forward for 70 years, and it's not that we're running out of children. That happened 40 years ago. We're now running out of adults. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. I'm just saying that it took globalization to take industrialization global.
Okay.
The Industrial Revolution originally was in the United Kingdom, but really just in the greater London area. And then it spread to Germany and the United States and a handful of European countries, but never into the countryside. Most of the world didn't really get down to the serious work of industrializing the secondary cities until the war. And in the case of the countryside, most of the advanced world didn't finish the process until the 1960s. So it took global security to enable true globalization to occur.
Because we've been
It was a mix
doing
of
free
things.
trade
I
globally
mean,
a long
number
time.
one, number one is technology. If you're dealing with wooden sailing vessels, the sea is a very dangerous place. And so it wasn't until later, in kind of the second phase of globalization, that we had merchant shipping in metal. And that is just in the last century. I'm sorry, it was just in the 20th century. That's relatively new. Also, originally, a lot of the industrial technologies were all about military conflict. So they would cause more disruption than would save. And in those first handful of countries, most notably the Brits, that were enabled to industrialize, they could basically use industrialization like a crowbar to beat potential colonies or foes into submission, and it wasn't deliberately shared with the rest of the world. It took some time for those technologies to leak out. And then, of course, we had the World Wars, and that is when America rewired the rules. The United States was never forced to offshore anything. That was honestly a side effect of the choice of globalization. Before globalization, the only countries that would be technologically advanced were the ones that had a geography that allowed them to generate most of what they needed internally, and then they would use that strength to venture out to get the things that they didn't have. Those were the empires. What globalization did was allowed everyone to play without having to have that military component. So you could have been a secondary colony, but all of a sudden you can engage in global trade. And when everyone could play, value added expanded, people both diversified and specialized, and got into more and more value added manufacturing. So the need for a financial system to lubricate all of that internally to a country and internationally in terms of trade exploded. And in that sort of an environment, gold couldn't fly. Every successful asset-backed currency we have known in human history has ultimately collapsed because they ran out of the material that backed it. And if we were suddenly dealing with growth rates that were just explosive, the global system grew more between 1945 and 1970 than throughout the entirety of human history. There was never going to be enough gold to back all of that. Fiat, whether for better or for worse, based on your own personal politics, was the only answer, the only approach that might have worked. So far, so good. Let's start with demographics. The same process of having fewer kids happened as the Chinese industrialized, just as happened with everybody else. But where with the United States it took place relatively slowly over roughly 200 years, they've done it in 40. So they've gone from living on subsistence rice farms to living in condos in a single generation. And as a result, their birth rate has gone from something like 6 to 7 per woman to now less than 1 in most of the major cities.
Right.
Shanghai and Beijing actually have the lowest birth rates of any cities in any era, and they're going down, not up. You add in the one-child policy on top of that, and we're dealing with a population which is already in the stages of advanced collapse. The Chinese population undoubtedly peaked more than 10 years ago, and they are now on track to have less than half their current population as soon as 2050, and that assumes that nothing goes wrong with those all-important energy and food imports. So yes, this is a system, this is a culture that is facing abject collapse in the not-too-distant future. Then, of course, there's the broader geopolitical environment. Globalization was basically made for countries like China, countries that had never really been fully functional or economic entities in their own right. They were always preyed upon by outsiders or broken apart due to internal conflict. Globalization, for all intents and purposes, ended all that, and this has been the most unified that the Chinese system has ever been in the 3,500-year-long history of the Han Chinese people. All the Americans have to do if they want to wreck it is go home, and we're in the process of doing that right now. China imports 3/4 of their energy, and 3/4 of that comes from the Persian Gulf or further abroad, and they utterly lack the naval capacity in order to protect their own supply lines. And even if they could protect their own supply lines, the world is turning populist. Nobody wants to be dependent upon Chinese goods anymore. So everything that has spelled Chinese success since 1980 has now come violently unwound, in part because of Chinese actions, and there's no way they walk away from this. Well, let me kill a couple of those squirrels and then we'll get into the bigger issues. When you spend $12 billion for a $2 billion asset, that isn't investment, that is capital flight. That is some Chinese bureaucrat who's figured out a way to cheat his own system and get money out for another day when it's finally his time to leave. We saw a lot of this in the late Soviet period as well. So anything that touches one belt, one road, anything that looks like an asset that the Chinese are purchasing but they don't know how to operate, that is all capital flight. That's Chinese voting against their own system and basically taking money from the government and squirreling it away for themselves for a rainy day. One of the things we've seen with one belt, one road is every single country but one is refusing to pay back the loans. They're even denying that they were ever loans in the first place. They're like, yeah, no, these were grants. We're going to keep this money. Thanks much. The one country, the one exception, is Sri Lanka, which is in a state of abject civil collapse right now. So I would not expect payments on that debt to continue for all that much longer. That's another squirrel. I mean, this is not how energy deals are made. If you sign a contract, sure, but it's not like you pay for it all up front. You pay for it as you get it. It's a slightly different way of handling the accounting. It really doesn't signal nearly as much of a commitment as people like to think. The only countries that do it in large scale are Russia and China, and it's difficult to come up with two methods of accounting that the rest of the world broadly has no interest in following. Well, I would say all the ones that they've done to this point have been broken. Whether it's because they were being upgraded or downgraded is kind of irrelevant. It's a flashy headline. It is negotiated at the top and then it's handed down to the bureaucrats, and so that's a 30-year deal, but it's very rare for them to last more than 4 or 5. To a degree, the Chinese get a bad rap when it comes to innovation. Now, they have a very small cadre of very smart people who are actually pretty good at innovating, particularly when it comes to software and with big data stuff. When you get down into manufacturing, that's where it starts to fall apart. They can't make the machines that allow them to make the cheap goods. So they have a small cadre that's very good, but it's not large enough to train the people that are a step down. So we will continue to hear about the Chinese making breakthroughs in big data related tech, but it's everything else, the nuts and bolts, that's where they do not excel at all. In terms of immigration, it's a big boulder to try to find a lever for. There were 1.4 billion Chinese, well, with the data revisions, there's 1.3 billion Chinese, and now the majority of them are aged 45 and over.